Welcome to Open Source Health, the podcast that doesn't just talk about fixing healthcare, we're actively doing it. I'm Trip Johnson, CEO of the Advita Collective, and I'm here to take you on a behind-the-scenes journey as we build a technology-forward, stakeholder-centric healthcare company. Our mission? Bring transparency and innovation to an industry that desperately needs both. Join us as we dive into the intersections of policy, technology, and hands-on healthcare, offering a rare glimpse into the challenges and triumphs of creating a system that works for everyone: patients, providers, policymakers, payers, and technologists alike. We'll share our journey of building in the open, and we'll have candid conversations with our team and other like-minded change makers who are as passionate as we are about revolutionizing healthcare. This is Open Source Health, where we don't just diagnose the problems, we roll up our sleeves and work on the solutions. Let's get started.
Welcome to Open Source Health, a very special Open Source Health because the talking heads are minus Trip today. So maybe we'll actually talk about something interesting. I'm joking. But anyway, today we have a special guest on, Corey Kennedy, our clinical director for the Advita Collective. Her and I were talking offline earlier this week. She's coming back from maternity leave, and I thought she had some really interesting thoughts and experiences with this. And she, I guess in her throes of early motherhood, was listening to the podcast and asked to be a guest on it at some point. When she was talking about this, I thought she had some really interesting thoughts. It would be really cool to get on a podcast. I thought it might be really useful for some people. So thanks for volunteering. And I think this is a particularly vulnerable topic. So I appreciate you pulling up to the table for it.
Yeah. I mean, I think we need to talk about it more.
Yeah. So with that, how about this? Give us just a quick snippet of who you are, your background, maybe like your sort of orientation to healthcare, like how do you think about healthcare? And then we'll introduce the topic of postpartum return to work.
Okay. Yeah, I actually have a undergrad degree in community health education. So I think I knew from an early age that I cared about like population health. At the time, I didn't realize it was going to kind of morph into being a mental health provider. But I knew that I wanted to work in healthcare. And at an early age, like I just cared about helping people. So, after undergrad, I worked for a little bit in the community under the Governor's Crime Commission grant, which was focused on youth recidivism and incarceration. So worked on that, realized like, wow, there's like a huge mental health piece to this, and kind of realized like when we look at population health that, sometimes we don't think about the mental health aspect. And so went back, got my master's. A lot of my research was in healthcare, more around access to services, what trends were happening in mental health that state legislators needed to hear about. How are we talking about mental health and substance use? And that impacts the way I think we approach it. Right. So the diction is important. Did some research in that, did a lot of work with interpersonal, like interdisciplinary teams. So did some research in that, worked on some coursework with a professor there, realized I wanted to work with adults. So after grad school, ended up working in community mental health, which was incredible. I think it made me kind of the clinician I am today, and is a lot of what I've tried to bring, I think, here in our clinical department. So did community support team, was a DBT therapist, and then quickly got into clinical leadership. So have about like 6 years in clinical leadership, been in the field for almost 10. And Trip recruited me for like 4 or 5 years. And I kept, I think that the community mental health person in me was just not quite ready to make the jump. I kind of told him like, you don't even have psychiatrists. Like, who am I going to work with? So you don't, it didn't really align with, I think, the way I view healthcare, which is like increasing access, creating these systems that support an actual human versus like putting them in a box.
Yes.
And so I think like that's what we've built here.
Pretty cool.
Is the system. Yeah, it's awesome. So they went in network. I was like, all right, I'll come now. So here I am.
So
been here 2 years today, Marcus.
Hey, Mazel Tov, 2-year anniversary. Yeah. it is wild to think about the amount of growth and change that's happened. I actually think this is kind of an interesting segue. I think initially a year ago, had you left during a maternity leave, I think there probably would have been a different reaction in the system. And I think you've done a great job of building a system that has a lot of redundancies and fragility. So, I'm kind of curious to hear, what was your experience like the first time leaving on maternity leave, and then this sort of time? I think that's generally going to be the kind of focus of conversation, but I'd love you to start by telling us kind of what your experience was the first time returning postpartum to work. And let's just start there and we'll just see where this thing goes.
Yeah, I mean, a metaphor I'd give is like it hit me like a ton of bricks. Like I was, I wasn't prepared. I mean, I had no idea, right? I just have, I think it illuminated these like expectations I have of myself. And I was like, wow, like that's intense, because I knew I was like competitive and a perfectionist.
Yeah.
But maybe not that much. The thing was, I was coming into a new company I'd never worked for, and bringing over my private practice to work here, and while also like being a first time mom.
Jesus Christ.
And I was like, and it seriously, like,
it's so dark when you put it in that, like when you put that framing on it, it's like, Jesus Christ, what were you thinking?
Well, that's exactly right, Marcus. And that's kind of like what I looking back, I'm like, yeah, what was I thinking?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think the thought was like, I've been able to handle everything else like so far in my career, and have, at least on paper, been pretty successful. And
right.
I wasn't this time. And so it was tough. It was a hard thing to accept. I definitely didn't prepare myself. I was like, oh, well, I'll just like figure it out. Like that's what people do. And I think it's because we actually don't talk about it. We don't talk about what it's like. Yeah. And I think
I really wanted you to speak on this.
Right. And like not specific, I think, and not to minimize what it's like to be a male in this situation or any other gender, but as a mom, like a a mom, I think it has this unique layer on it.
Right.
And I think like, especially for me, I know that I think I'd never heard the concept of like mom guilt, and I didn't understand it. Well, I didn't even know it was a thing. And then I think it just like, that's what hit me. It was that.
Yeah.
It was, it's like what we tell ourselves all the time about, well, that's not going to happen to me. Like, I'm not going to get postpartum depression. And if I do, well, I work in mental health, so like it's going to be fine. Like I'm going to know exactly what to do.
I'll take a walk.
Yeah.
I can use my DBT skills. Yeah.
That's right. And that didn't work. None of that worked, right? And so it became this moment where I was like, wow, I need help. I think for someone who is a perfectionist and is competitive, that's just like a difficult thing to admit. Right. And you also, I think about like, I'm the one who's helping other people, right? I'm in leadership, I'm in clinical leadership. And so it's sometimes it's hard, it's hard to think like, oh, well, I actually do need help. And so,
right.
Yeah, it was a difficult return. And I'm lucky that Tripp is the owner of our company. I'm lucky that I have, the familial support system that I have.
What were some of the personal and professional challenges, like specifically, hang a little meat on those bones? I'd be curious if you're comfortable talking about some of the personal, but also like then lead into maybe some of the professional that you just weren't expecting.
Yeah, I mean, they're both so intertwined, I think, because
there's a weird bifurcation since we spend most of our time at work. Yeah. Fair.
Right. And I remember our medical director, Dr. Book, asking me like, how are you doing like as a new mom and being back to work? And I remember joking, which is like 100% not a joke.
Yeah, but that's usually your go-to, right?
But I just laughed anyway. I said, well, if you take a perfectionist and someone who's really competitive, and then you give them this living being that they're supposed to keep alive, but you don't give them a manual, just imagine like how that's going. And that's about how it's going. So all that
keep this baby alive better than anyone else.
Yes.
Yeah. This baby's gonna be so alive.
Very alive.
Yeah. I'm gonna crush how
alive it can be. Yeah. And the truth is, like, there isn't a manual. You're figuring it out. And so I would say, like, the personal challenges, like on top of like being formally diagnosed with postpartum depression that time, both times actually, which I'm sure we'll get into, but being like formally diagnosed, and the personal and also like professional challenges were that I just had this full body depression. Like I didn't, and it's wild, I was, was describing it as like, I'm not cognitively depressed. Like my daughter is like one of the best things that's ever happened to me.
Right.
It was like this amazing experience. But my body was just like, was like failing me, so to speak. And, cognitively, like I didn't feel like myself. And I remember my first thought, which is wild. And I think this is a testament to like how much, there's a lot more talk about it than there used to be in terms of postpartum depression. But to be honest, like my experience was it wasn't talked about enough. Because my first thought was like, I'm just not getting sleep. That was my first thought, right? It wasn't like, wow, there's like something else probably going on here.
Yeah.
I couldn't get out of bed. I remember Trip and I having a discussion, like a couple of discussions, I think the 2 weeks before I just ended up taking about a month off. And I was like, I don't really know what's going on. This is wild. Like, I just don't feel right.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it was hard to take a step away from work. Like it's something that has brought me a lot of joy, especially clinical leadership. I think being excited to like build a new team, to finally be here. I'd known Trip for a few years. And so it felt like a failure, right? It felt like I'm failing. And so I took some time off to take care of myself. And I think was like really lucky that Trip believed in me. Like he let me come back.
Yeah. This is an interesting timeline, and I hate to interrupt you, but I'm kind of curious to maybe offer some perspective from sort of the outside, or like add a little context. And I'm kind of curious to hear if I'm sort of projecting myself into it. And so I'd be kind of curious to hear your thoughts on it. But most people wouldn't know this, but that was the time that the company was really, really in flux. Like, we're, probably one of the closer times to the whole thing sort of imploding and going under. And I think in some ways there was, when you agreed to come on board, I know internally, especially with like Trip, Nick, myself, there was just this like, oh God, like there's like, we have this sort of white knight coming in to like save the whole thing. Because I think at the time, really, where like there's a lot of leaks across the ship, right? We're trying to figure out the business aspects of it. We're trying to figure out how to, improve marketing. And then, on top of that, then there's just but none of us are like the type of people that are comfortable selling something and making money off of something that we don't think is good. And so we're like laboring under this, like we don't think we're doing good clinical work.
Yeah.
And like you came in and I think you offered this like, oh, thank God, like this thing's going to work out. And then you had to take some time off. I'm curious if you felt burdened by that narrative at all, right? Like this white knight coming in, and if that contributed to any of it or like played into any of the perfectionism that you're talking
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it did. I remember like apologizing to Trip like profusely. I take like what I do very seriously. I think the other thing was supporting the team that we had here. Like I knew that I could do that. I had been successful in the past, and like it felt also like I was saying hi, bye, like and I felt I had this like unjustified guilt, because the truth is like we all work in mental health and substance use, and we talk a lot about taking care of our patients, and we also have to take care of ourselves. And so I think, yes, I had this unjustified guilt. I think at the time I definitely wasn't telling myself it was unjustified.
Yeah.
But yeah, I felt like this sense of needing to prove that, Trip was right in choosing me.
Yeah.
Right. And then you've got to like take a month off, and I'm sure they're like, what?
Yeah. It was funny. I think I was privy to a lot of those conversations at the time, and there was never any of that sort of energy. It was just, I remember having this like, this very funny moment with Trip. He called and he was like, well, listen, the good news is Corey, like Corey's starting, and like she's still here and everything's good. And he said, the bad news is she's got to take some time off. We're like, all right, yeah, well, we'll keep figuring it out. But it was like, I don't know, in some way it was a very like, yeah, this just has to sort of happen. So it's like interesting because I feel, I think at least for myself, and we didn't really know each other at the time, but I think especially for myself, there's just like general sense of let's not like, I want to not put any, like, I don't want her to feel any sort of pressure. And I think that was like generally like the idea, but it's like, to your point, right? We don't talk about these sort of things. It's like coworkers, friends, peers, I can't speak for Trip, but like his business owners, it's like, yeah, well, wait, what's the playbook for supporting this person right now?
Yeah,
So
there probably isn't one.
Yeah, I mean, probably. But
I mean, I think
interesting dynamics, I think.
For sure. And I mean, I think what happened was like something that should be in a playbook.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I actually never felt, I got a lot of support, it kind of crashed all these, these ideas in my head that I was failing and that people were like disappointed. I got this overwhelming support from people I like even barely knew. Like I had just gotten here,
right.
And yeah, everyone was like, wow, like, thank you for sharing. Cause I sent that email and they were like, thank you for sharing, like, take care of yourself. And, I think it speaks to the leader that you are, that you're willing to open up a little bit and let us know what's going on. And that, so it ended up, I think, being, okay. I definitely don't want to go away from work, but it ended up being okay.
Yeah.
And I'm still here. So
you are still here and you're better. Yeah. We're all better for it. Yeah. I mean, I think something that's interesting, you kind of brought up, there's 2 points I want to circle back to, because I think they might be illuminative or helpful for people. So one is like you talked about cognitively, you knew you weren't right, but you felt the depression like in your body. And I'd be really curious to hear you speak about that first. Like I would just like illuminate that just for anybody, right? Like, I mean, whoever may listen to this, I'd be really curious, like, because that seems like there was some sort of discrepancy between, like, I don't know that I'm depressed, something, but you were talking about feeling in your body. Like, I'm kind of curious about that.
Yeah, it felt like I was wearing a weighted blanket around. Like we all, I know, like, intellectually as a therapist that, people who are talking slower, moving slower, not able to complete tasks, not getting up, like I knew that intellectually is how depression can show up. And I just, I felt it. And I think the interesting part is like having that intellectual understanding and still not connecting it to saying that I have that until I was like diagnosed. So yeah, I was like wearing a weighted blanket. I mean, there were some days I didn't get out of bed for a long time in the afternoon. It was that heavy. And of course, like I told you, I like equated it to sleep. And then I was telling, I go to, you got to go to the OB like for multiple appointments after. And he was like, yeah, so you have postpartum depression? And I was like, wait, what? It
no, I can't have depression.
Totally. It did connect. Then I was like, oh, yep, that makes sense. But yeah, it was like full body, and it's as a perfectionist and so not even cognitively, like as it wasn't like, oh my God, I'm depressed, I'm so sad kind of stuff. It was, I noticed that the voices in like a perfectionist head or a competitive individual's head were louder. Right. And I just equated it to like, this is just an adjustment. Like I'm a new mom. Everyone goes through this, and like, this is just what we do.
Yeah.
And the truth is, like, I didn't have to suffer like that.
Piece I'd like to hear you speak about, you talked about this idea of like, I think I reflexively talked about like personal and professional life, is that there's some sort of like sharp bifurcation between the two, right? Like I generally believes like all life is just all life, right? Like there's no professional life, there's no hobbies or interests, like everything is just everything, right? Like what I learn in one arena, I take to the next, and vice versa. And you talked about this idea of like, to take care of my patients, right? Like I'm supposed to take care of them, right? And we always tell people self-care, all that sort of stuff. And so one of the things I'd like to hear you maybe talk a little bit about is just that notion, right? Like this idea of taking care of ourselves, that we're not actually able to show up in a way that's like us not taking care of ourselves in our personal life is going to show up in our professional life, and um, you know, all that sort of stuff. So I'd just be curious to hear your thoughts on that, or like reflections.
Yeah, I mean, I think I knew pretty quickly. I think the other thing that's involved in this is like ethics. Like, I was not, functioning cognitively, right? Like, my body was just like, wearing around a weighted blanket all day. If you feel like that, you're definitely not going to do therapy for someone. So, I mean, like, ethically, I definitely had to take a step back from
Mhm.
seeing the people. So I had to make sure they were taken care of, and kind of transfer their care and made sure they felt supported. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have been able to do what I needed to do, like for the team, and I think even the people we serve, if I didn't take a step back.
Right.
Um, and I think that's hard. It's hard in our profession. I mean, I think we talk about it a lot. I think we talk about it a lot in grad school, and then you get in the real world, and you're just like, wow, I really don't know how to generalize that. You're kind of figuring it out. I think luckily I've had like a little bit of time in the field to develop like some pretty good boundaries and self-care and limits, and that's been helpful. But it's the similar thing to leaving the team that early. It was this like idea of unjustified guilt that like most people in our profession are in it because they want to care for other people. Like, we get lost in that. And so I think it was another moment that was like, I do need to pay attention to this. It's something, I don't want to say like out of body experience, but like I've supervised a lot of clinicians, and I've always said, your limits are your limits and your boundaries are your boundaries because they are. And I always tell them like they're going to shift, they're going to change over time. Like, you're going to learn new things about yourself. You're going to have new experiences that you're going to have to change those limits and boundaries. And like, that's okay. They're fluid. I have been so set in like what my limits and boundaries were for so long, because I had like I felt like, a good self-care plan. And I had to like change it up, and it meant like taking a step away from something that I loved. And I think, kind of like we were speaking on before, I mean, I realized that what it actually did was made me a better clinician, a better leader, and a better supervisor, having had, I think, this experience. And to be honest, like, you're in clinical leadership, and we can talk about self-care all day long, but if your leadership doesn't model it, then you've got this unhealthy idea of work-life balance that you're supposed to have. And so, I mean, I feel, I definitely don't want to like have postpartum depression, but I also, it was this really cool experience where I had a chance to like model what I'd been, preaching. So practice what you preach. And
You realized what was going on. You got diagnosed. What course of action did you take from there?
Yeah, so I I ended up starting taking medication. I saw someone who was like specifically trained in postpartum depression. I obviously, I've been going to a therapist, and so I ramped that up, and continued seeing her, and she was very supportive. I think the other thing was, it was my actual like natural support system, right? So talking to people about it, like telling my husband, this is what's going on, telling the people around me that care about me, like, this is what's going on. And so it was really just like this first time that I was like, hey, I need help.
Right.
Like, this is what's going on. And so I think that's the actions I took the first time, because I was playing catch up.
Right.
I had, it just, like I said, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I had no idea what was going on.
You talked about playing catch up a little bit, right? So going into this time, how did you avoid playing catch up? What did you do? What lessons did you take from the first go around?
I took all the lessons. I mean, I think I was much more proactive. I mean, I had some muscle memory. This was not my first kid, and so that was helpful. I ended up, I started medication earlier. Um, and I got educated. I mean, the thing is, one of the takeaways for me was that we don't talk about this enough.
Right.
And I think there's, the other thing that happened, and not a bad or good thing, is that I think a lot of my providers knew what I did for a living. And I think maybe assumed that I was competent in postpartum depression. Surprise, I wasn't. So, I think that was one of the things that stood out to me is, we really weren't talking about it enough. It's almost like, we do this screener. We ask you about your mood. I mean, even the pediatrician, but just, it wasn't enough the first time. And so this time, like, I knew, like, I have to take ownership of this. And luckily, like I said, the muscle memory. So, I went ahead and talked to my provider. I got connected to a specialist, and I ended up doing, I knew a little bit about IFS,
You beat me to
not
it.
a lot. And so I ended up, like, I think proactively asking my therapist, like, I'd done a lot of like thinking after the first time and kind of thinking like, well, what parts of that made it even more difficult other than the hormonal changes that, that contribute to postpartum depression. And it was this competitive perfectionist piece of me. And so we ended up targeting that with IFS, and we were proactive about it. And I just, and I think the other thing was I did some reflection after I was clear-headed the first time. And as my husband and I were planning, to have another child, I was like, this is how we've got to do this differently. I needed to use my resources. And the thing is, it's just crazy that that I didn't generalize, like, I use resources in my job all the time. Right. And I didn't generalize it to like my personal life until the second go around. And so I really was, I was talking to him about it. I was like, I think this is what I need this time around. And so there was a lot more planning. I think the other thing I did was Trip and Nick were like massively supportive. I had a conversation with like planning before I went out and conversations about, what I kind of needed when I came back. And they were super amenable to that. And so I think it's all of that, like all the things that I struggled with the first time, just I took care of before I came back. And it's made a world of difference.
Give some real specific examples about that.
Yeah. I mean, I ended up asking if I could be in the office part-time, like my first week back. The other piece that comes with this beautiful thing we call mom guilt is when you take your child to daycare for the first time, right? And so that's the battle of being a mom that also works, I think, is having to go take your kid somewhere else during the day. And so I wanted, my son to gradually kind of adjust, right? You think about like adjustment to change. And so I wanted him to gradually adjust, and I wanted to like be kinder to myself this time and just more realistic. So I did a gradual build up to the hours I was spending in the office. I was back full time. I slowly came back. Like, I think I started to answer emails, started to kind of ease my way back in, and then ease my way back into full-time office work. I think the other thing is I didn't come in and just like tell myself, the perfectionist part of my brain, like tell myself that I had to like do all these things as soon as I got back, and I think it was communicating more realistically with Nick and Trip about, what I could do. So I would say the gradual increase, I would say delegating more, right? Like we do have a really strong team here of clinicians. And so it was easy to say like, I don't have to handle this today, like, because I was only supposed to be in the office till 2 today, right? Like it's the delegation. I think the other thing specifically was talking about it, was telling people like how I was doing, and not the like fake, yeah, I'm fine, everything's great. Like when they ask you like, so how are you doing? Right. It's like, well, today was the first day I took him. I'm having a hard day. Like, I had a good cry and ate a donut, and now I'm at work. And it's, I miss him. I miss my kids when I'm at work. And I think what I had to realize, which was just this sort of epiphany, was there's always going to be this pull. Like, I think values work, right? And this is important too. And I value my work and I value my family. And there was this just, I know, to pull DBT into it, it's hard not to, but there was this radical acceptance that instead of trying to constantly change and overcompensate, like, oh, I need to do more momming, or I need to do more leading, or I need to do more clinical, it was this radical acceptance that I'm living with the pull, that I'm going to be pulled to want to do this, right? Like, my values pull me here, my values pull me there. And that's like normal, like to normalize it. And so I think I had to like really, really accept that's actually the new norm for me as a working mom and someone who's a perfectionist and competitive and cares a lot about what they do and also cares a lot about our family. And I think once I did that, I was just like a lot more comfortable with that value conflict.
It makes me think of like this idea of flow state versus this sort of linear process, right? Like you're not, and you feel like you have to do all of those things and you have to do all of them well, right? Like you're setting up these constant binds of conflict where it's like, yeah, this is a fell point, this is a fell point, this is a fell point. The experience of being pulled in a lot of different directions and having a lot of masters right now is just literally all one experience, right? Like it's just like one flowing experience. And if I don't fight that and I just sort of accept that is the nature of what this is, then we'd be way more effective at all of the tasks anyway. But like suffering unnecessarily with this like, conflict and fighting ghosts or something, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a great way to put it.
Minutes left. About like meta lessons from this, or like something big to take from this. So like postpartum conversations, workplace. What would you like to see more workplaces do? And then lastly, what I'd be curious if you could give advice to someone in your similar position or the past version of yourself, what would be the advice that you would give? So start with the first part and then hit us with the second.
Yeah. In terms of workplace, I mean, honestly, I think it's educating. Like if you're in a managerial or leadership position where you're supervising someone, or working alongside, I guess even working alongside someone that's, recently, either given birth to a child or has a child. I think it's educating yourself on how that impacts people returning to work. I think that's the first step. And I think it's building the support network that's in your organization around some of that stuff. So, can they work from home some the first few weeks? Can we do flexible hours, right? So that they can, if they're having challenges with the daycare stuff. I think it's that gradual adjustment and supporting people through that. Trying to think of like even more tangible things, but I think the first part is like we don't talk about it. No one, I mean, I think now like we know, right? Like people know that this is a thing. And I mean, we know it's a thing, but then you see it happen in your organization and you're like, yeah.
We have to make sure that we have a plan for this.
Yeah. And so it's making an adjustment. It's, being more inclusive of individuals who've gone through this experience. It's just like we're doing all the time. Like we're always constantly trying to be supportive of what other people are going through. And so I think this is one that just doesn't get talked about. It's like, oh, it's this thing that's been happening forever. Like people have been having babies forever. It's not, And so it's just, I think it's giving attention to it, right? I think a lot of people end up everyone around you is like, oh my God, you had a baby. It's this like most amazing experience. Everything's so happy. Everything's so great. And the truth is like, check on your moms. Like they're struggling. People are struggling. And it's this massive adjustment. Just because we've been doing it forever doesn't mean we've found a way to respond to it effectively as organizations or even as a society. I think the second piece, advice to other people in like a similar position or to myself is, I mean, it's okay. I mean, the first thing is like, it's okay to need help, even as a leader, as a perfectionist, as a competitive person. And in fact, it doesn't indicate weakness. I think it indicates a lot of strength. And I think it's something we have to do to model for other individuals who experience this. So I would just say it's okay. To need help. I would also say like this is normal.
Right.
This is normal. Like, I think a lot of times moms end up, and especially like, I mean, working moms, even stay-at-home moms, that they're supposed to mask that this is hard. It's like, you chose to be a mom. You wanted to be a mom. It's this amazing thing you gave. There's life. And that's all true. That is all true. And it's hard.
Right.
Both of those are true. So I think it's just to be more real about it. For people to be more real about it, that motherhood is amazing, and it's also one of the hardest things I've ever done.
I think that's like a completely reasonable and fair place to kind of leave this at this point. I like this idea of just, hey, these are all very normal feelings. Don't fight them. Ask for help. All that sort of stuff. Like I do agree. Like it is this interesting piece that you're sort of talking about, right? Like all of us in theory totally want to support moms and, like as an organization and all that sort of stuff. But until like the rubber met the road, it was like, oh, wait, you actually have to figure out how to do this. Like, it's not enough to just say like, no, I like maternity leave. That's great. Go for it. Big fan, like how do you actually help? So, did you, like taking the time and, verbal and, with us.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
So we'll wrap up. Thanks, everyone.